Joining us on the line is Bishop Robert Barron. He is Bishop of the Diocese of Winona, Rochester in Minnesota, and founder of Word on Fire Catholic Ministries. He's also a #1 Amazon bestselling author. He's published a bunch of books. His latest is called The Great Story of Israel, Election, Freedom, Holiness. Bishop, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Ben, good to be with you.
So it does feel for people of traditional theological bent as though basic traditional values are now under assault. We have a couple of big news stories about that I wanted to get your take on. Obviously, one of the big stories is this case before the Supreme Court, 303 Creative LLC versus Alinas, in which an evangelical Christian woman who's a web designer says that she won't commission marriage websites for gay couples. And the court seems to be taking up the question as to whether this is a creative services versus regular services question, or whether it's a legitimate religious belief or not. Now, how should Americans view a case like this?
I think we have to allow people that believe in traditional marriage to articulate that publicly and not have their speech compelled and forced. I think that's what alarms people the most. It's a cultural move now, not just to assert the validity of gay marriage, but to compel those who hold opposite views to celebrate in even a public way, to celebrate what they don't believe in. I think it's the coercive element of this that is really problematic. So you put it in religious liberty terms, I think that's true, but it's coerced speech. And it's the aggressiveness of this really new quasi-religious ideology. And I think those who are defenders of the traditional religions and traditional moral beliefs find this pretty alarming.
You know, Bishop, one of the things that I find really alarming is how traditional religious believers sort of got boxed into this argument that the only reason that you could possibly be in favor of traditional marriage is if you are a traditional religious believer. So the fact that cases like this have now been essentially created as religious carve-outs is very frightening to me, because essentially what this case and the new same-sex marriage law that is going to be signed into law by Joe Biden say is that if you are sort of a normal, rational person, then you're not only totally fine with same-sex marriage, you should be very pro-same-sex marriage, and you should oppose bigotry in all of its forms. But if you're one of those weird Bible believers who still thumps that thing, and you go to church every Sunday or you go to synagogue every Saturday, well, then you're just one of these weirdos, and we'll make special provision for you because the founders kind of wanted to make special provisions for freedom of religion, but really you're kind of quasi-bigots. And once we are on that rhetorical road, it seems like only a matter of time until the left has its way completely and religious freedom is seen as a form of bigotry, as it is in Canada, for example, or in the UK.
Right. You're putting a finger on the loss of the natural law tradition. So prescinding from a particular religious view of things, there's the natural law tradition that, Jews and Muslims and Christians have in common, that there's an intelligibility built into the nature of reality, and that we can read off moral values from that. And so all people of good mind and goodwill should be able to appreciate these values. And you're right, to put it immediately into the religious context skews it a bit. The tradition that goes from ancient times through Thomas Aquinas and Moses Maimonides all the way up to Martin Luther King, where reasonable people took it for granted that the positive law of a society should be grounded in the natural law of the moral law. That's prescinding from, particular religious claims. Though, our great tradition would say the moral law in turn is grounded in the eternal law, the mind of God. But I think you can say, I can put this thing in a purely sort of rational context, but the loss of that tradition means that a sort of moral voluntarism holds sway. So things are good if I want them to be good, what I determine to be good by my own will. And that ancient problem, voluntarism, I think is haunting the scene today. And it's a bracketing of the rational dimension. It's a bracketing of our capacity to see objective intelligibilities in the world. Everything comes down to the will. And my self-assertive will now is the ground of law. It's the loss of the great natural law tradition that's behind a lot of this mischief.
Now, Bishop Barron, the way that you describe that obviously really describes the conflict over marriage, because for people who believe in the natural law tradition, the basic idea of marriage is that it is a description of a real situation on the ground and a formalization of that description because that thing is good, meaning males and females produce children. We have formalized that relationship, right, that family unit on a societal level and protected that unit because it provides the basis of all civilization. But now, if you ask most Americans what marriage constitutes, they will tell you it is a purely voluntaristic relationship. They will tell you that family
right.
itself is a purely voluntaristic relationship. All traditional religion sees family as an obligation, right? You have obligations to your brothers and sisters, literally, not everybody being a brother and sister, but literally your brothers and sisters. And you have specific biblical obligations to your parents because your parents are your parents and you owe them a special obligation. And now if you ask most people what makes a family, they'll just say people who love each other, which of course is not a description of anything real.
Right. One of the fundamental problems here, I'll quote my mentor, Francis Cardinal George, the late Archbishop of Chicago, and he said, the real problem is that the government has no business defining marriage. Marriage is, in a way, is a pre-political reality. It belongs to the natural law. It comes up out of our very bodiliness. It comes up out of the most elemental structures of our life together. Now, government can regulate it, government can protect it, but government can't define it. So that's one of the signs of the suspension of the natural law tradition is government is now intervening to redefine it. And then you're right, it's been defined along purely personalist, voluntarist lines. Furthermore, the religions have long recognized, and people sensitive to natural law have recognized, that the civil government has an interest, should have an interest in fostering the family. In Catholic social teaching, it's not the individual that's the basis of society, but the family. And so it's good for a civil society to foster the relationship between a man and a woman who give rise to children. That's not just a religious preoccupation, that's a civil good and has been recognized as such from the beginnings of the natural law tradition.
And it is very clear that the left is fully at war with this. I mean, I was quoting earlier in the show an article in the New York Times actually about our outlet, Daily Wire, because we've moved into the entertainment field. And there's a quote from this piece in the New York Times about us. It comes from Media Matters, which is, of course, a wild left organization. And it really is telling. There's a guy named Ari Drennan, who's the LGBTQ program director for Media Matters. And he was condemning us because he said that the Daily Wire, quote, has laid out this belief in traditional views of gender and sexuality as a cornerstone of Western civilization. I mean, he's just saying that, like, I would say the exact same thing that Media Matters is saying. Right. But for me, that's a perfectly obvious truth that male, female, these things are not the same, is a basis for Western civilization. Male, female, child, created family units. These are what civilization is based on. But the left very often fundamentally believes, the social left believes, that the unit of demarcation is the individual. And even when it comes to the individual, you owe no duty to essentially anyone else. It is your sense of sexual self-identity that is literally the most important thing about you.
Well, and that's the side of it I always recognize as a type of Freudianism. I think Freud convinced the entire culture that the worst possible thing is the repression of my sexual desire. And so the unleashing of that I should have complete sexual freedom, is the key to happiness. I would argue that almost every statistic available proves the opposite. The happiness factor, especially among young people, is plummeting at the moment. So in a society of complete sexual freedom, people are not experiencing the happiness that a Freudianism would promise, but experiencing what, in fact, the traditional religions have long recognized. It'll lead to a deep unhappiness because it's at odds with the natural structure of things. So that worries me, not just as a philosopher, but also as a bishop, as a pastor, especially among young people. The unhappiness level is alarming. And it's not unrelated to these philosophical shifts in the way we look at the individual and society.
We're speaking with Bishop Robert Barron. So Bishop, one of the things that has been pushed forward by the Supreme Court and now is being pushed forward by, I would say, the quote-unquote more moderate wing of the Republican Party is this idea of what they've done in Utah, the so-called Utah Compromise. The Utah Compromise is this idea in law that you have very heavy-handed anti-discrimination laws that include sexual orientation, gender identity, and all the rest of the new categories that have been created by the social left, but will have broad carve-outs for religious institutions. The problem that I see is twofold. One, religious people aren't just religious inside their institutions. I'm religious throughout my entire life. And if I do not wish to give cover to activities that I consider to be sinful, it's not the government's business. And the founders would have been appalled by this. That's problem number one. And number two is the problem that I mentioned before, which is I don't think that compromise holds. I don't think that the other side of the aisle is willing to hear that compromise. I think they are openly calling for, in cases like 303 Creative, the idea that religion itself is a form of bigotry, or at least cover for bigotry, and that they'll start with get religion out of the public square. You're not allowed to operate your business, even a creative business, in accordance with your religion. And then why should we allow you to educate your child in accordance with this religious bigotry? That's a form of child abuse. Why should we allow you to raise your kids in a religious school? Why should we allow you to go to a church that won't perform same-sex marriages? Why shouldn't we remove the nonprofit status of these institutions and destroy them?
Right. You have to be blind not to see this as a pretty concerted attack on the traditional view. Look at the recent Respect for Marriage Act, that has been much lauded as acknowledging, exceptions for conscience and religious liberty. But all that's being guaranteed there is basically what's already in the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. I mean, we're told that we're not going to interfere with, I think the term is the solemnization of marriage. Well, that means the government's not going to come into churches and synagogues and tell us that we have to marry same-sex couples. Well, that, it seems to me, is already fully guaranteed in the First Amendment. So there's no real conscience protection, no real acknowledgement of religious liberty in all these other areas of life. So think of all the social service organizations that are affiliated with religions. I mean, from immigration services to adoption services to healthcare, et cetera. We worry very much that all of that is going to be under assault. It already is. But there's a steady attack on this long-standing understanding of our society. So it goes way beyond just, what's going to be pleasing to an individual person. This is a general cultural attack.
So, Bishop Barron, one of the questions that arises here is why religion has lost so much steam over the course of the last 60 years in the United States. The United States is still much more religious than other countries by statistics, but agnosticism, atheism are obviously growing. Secularism is growing. The churches seem to be hollowing themselves out more and more. Historic traditional institutions seem to be making sort of deals with secular left-wing culture in which the alligator will supposedly eat them last. And so the question becomes whether traditional institutions are going to be able to reinvigorate themselves, because the only areas of religion that are growing right now are in fact the ones that are significantly more traditional. In Judaism, for example, my religion, it is only the Orthodox that are growing demographically. Within a generation and a half, Reform and Conservative simply will not exist in the United States, demographically speaking. You're seeing the same thing in liberal churches all across the country. No one goes to them because if you wish to actually spend your Sunday hearing about left-wing social gospel, you can go to a football game and go out to a party later and skip the church entirely.
Right. Yeah, I've been tracing this for a long time. A lot of people have, and you're right. I mean, these trends are not encouraging. And certainly within the Christian churches, one of the clearest indications is that the forms of liberal Protestantism have sort of fallen off the table. So that's almost a complete surrender to the cultural consensus. Within the Christian churches, those that are I'd say boldly Orthodox, they're holding to the classical Orthodox beliefs are the ones that are growing. And of course they are, because people find that interesting and compelling. If we're just a vague echo of the secular culture, as you say, who cares? I think that a recovery of our confidence is key. I go back within the Catholic framework, even more broadly Christian framework, mid-20th century. Think of, from Evelyn Waugh to Thomas Merton to Fulton Sheen to Dorothy Day. We had a whole slew of figures, literary, cultural, theological, Christopher Dawson, many others, who had a very confident sense of Christianity, of Catholicism. And the church was, certainly compared to today, was flourishing. That loss of confidence, where did it come from? Well, the 60s and all that. And within the Catholic context, people will blame the Second Vatican Council, which is not fair. The council itself was a richly articulated, confident Catholicism. But for all kinds of cultural reasons, there was a loss of confidence. So, a recovery of that, a recovery of mere Christianity, if you want to use Lewis's term, just if all the Christian churches could claim their essential beliefs in God, in Christ, in redemption, in sin and grace, et cetera. But there's been a hand-wringing quality to so much of Christianity the last 50 or so years, and that's not helped the project at all.
So, Bishop Barron, this does raise the question of if you're going to have a strong and muscular church, a church that actually defends its own priorities, this means drawing lines. And one of the big problems in traditional religion is that there's been an unwillingness to draw lines. So to take a very contentious example, Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi claim that they are very, very Catholic people, and yet Nancy Pelosi supports abortion on demand, and she's out there championing same-sex marriage. Joe Biden is doing the same thing, plus both of them are promoting the idea that boys can be girls and girls can be boys. What should the Catholic Church do about issues like this?
Well, it should certainly, and I've done this now, I'm speaking in my own name, but also as a bishop of the church, to call that out as incoherent. And I got that language from Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who used it when he was Archbishop in Buenos Aires, now, of course, Pope Francis. There's an incoherence in being Catholic and holding to those views. And I think the church should call that out. Now, the way the church is structured, it's up to the individual bishop of a diocese to make that determination. So there, I'd cede it to the Archbishop of Washington or Archbishop of San Francisco. In the latter case, Archbishop Corleone has in fact said to Nancy Pelosi, you should not receive communion. The Archbishop of Washington has decided not to do that. So in our polity, our ecclesial polity, that's the way we resolve those issues. It's up to the individual bishop. I think at the very least to call out the incoherence of that position is a desideratum.
Well, that is Bishop Robert Barron. Again, you can check out his brand new book, The Great Story of Israel, Election, Freedom, and Holiness. He's an amazing thinker, and you should check out all of his work. Bishop Barron, really appreciate the time and the insight.